Was Hell's Angels' violent biker war with the Rock Machine MC truly a prolonged battle between equal powers, or something far more calculated unfolding beneath the explosions? The headlines showed bombings, assassinations, and retaliation. It looked like chaos. It felt like balance. But violence alone does not define war. This documentary examines whether the conflict sustained real parity, or whether one structure quietly tightened control while the other slowly lost ground under pressure.
He seemed to love it. Quebec's biker war raged for 8 years. More than 160 people were killed, and it made the man at the middle of it.
The structural imbalance, hidden behind the word war. The phrase Hell's Angels' violent biker war with the Rock Machine MC immediately frames the conflict as a battle between equals. War implies symmetry. It implies two forces with comparable strength, comparable reach, and comparable endurance. It suggests that escalation is mutual and that neither side holds decisive structural advantage. The early years of the Quebec conflict appeared to support that interpretation. Bombings were met with bombings. Assassinations triggered retaliation. Public fear expanded as both organizations demonstrated capacity for violence. Yet war, in its truest definition, requires more than reciprocal aggression. It requires sustained parity in infrastructure. Infrastructure determines whether retaliation can continue without collapse. Infrastructure determines whether leadership can be replaced, revenue preserved, and territory maintained under pressure. When examining the Hell's Angels and the Rock Machine MC beneath the headlines, structural differences emerge that complicate the word war. The Hell's Angels entered the conflict with decades of institutional development. Their charter system was standardized, hierarchy was clearly defined, authority moved through established channels, financial contributions were regulated across chapters, international expansion had already embedded resilience into the organization. Arrests in one region did not automatically paralyze another. Continuity was engineered. The Rock Machine MC emerged as a formidable challenger within Quebec. It expanded rapidly, recruited aggressively, and contested territory directly. Its growth demonstrated ambition and operational capability. However, rapid expansion can create strain. Centralized coordination was less entrenched. Regional authority often relied heavily on specific individuals. When those individuals faced arrest or removal, replacement structures were not always equally durable. In the early stages, visible violence masked these structural distinctions. Public perception solidified around the image of two evenly matched criminal empires. Media coverage reinforced that impression by focusing on explosions and body counts rather than governance models. But beneath the spectacle, one organization operated as a layered network built for endurance, while the other relied more heavily on momentum and regional cohesion. Territory was not pride, it was revenue. Territory in Hell's Angels' violent biker war with the Rock Machine MC was never just a patch on the back issue. It functioned as a controlled economic zone. Each neighborhood, highway corridor, and port-adjacent route represented a stream of predictable income, drug distribution, enforcement rackets, and control over secondary crews that operated beneath biker branding. When territory is treated as revenue infrastructure, violence becomes a business instrument, not an emotional reaction. The Hell's Angels approached territory as an administered asset. Chapters operated within defined boundaries and answered to higher coordination. This created a form of stability, even in conflict. Territorial disputes were not merely local feuds. They were evaluated through the lens of regional balance and long-term expansion. That structure matters because it limits spontaneous escalation. It channels aggression into tactical moves designed to produce lasting control rather than temporary intimidation. The Rock Machine MC expanded aggressively into contested zones, particularly during periods when Hell's Angels' influence in Quebec was being challenged or consolidated. Rapid occupation created momentum. It allowed the Rock Machine to appear as a direct counterweight, especially when their presence became visible in neighborhoods where independent crews and smaller clubs were accustomed to choosing sides. Visibility signaled power, but visibility also drew enforcement attention and forced the Rock Machine to defend newly claimed spaces before institutional control could fully settle. Once violence escalated, territorial stability became the real prize. Bombings and assassinations altered the cost of operating in certain areas. Businesses and local intermediaries were pushed into compliance. Smaller groups learned quickly that neutrality carried risk. Alignment decisions became survival strategies. In this environment, the organization that could enforce territory consistently, even after raids and arrests, gained structural advantage. Law enforcement pressure made this more decisive. Raids disrupted local distribution and forced adaptation. The Hells Angels, with broader networks and more diversified geographic depth, could reroute operations when a corridor became too hot. The Rock Machine, more concentrated and often dependent on key local figures, faced more severe disruption when specific hubs were compromised. That disruption weakens territorial grip, and weakened grip invites further encroachment. Territory is not won once. It must be maintained. The core question is whether this conflict stayed a true war of equals as the years progressed, or whether territory gradually stabilized under the organization best equipped to administer it under pressure. The map of control reveals more than the headlines ever did. Leadership, architecture, and decision control. In Hells Angels' violent biker war with the Rock Machine MC, explosions and gunfire drew public attention, but leadership stability determined who could endure. A violent organization can survive external attacks only if its command structure remains intact. When leadership fractures, retaliation slows, trust erodes, and territory becomes vulnerable, the real battlefield was not the streets, it was inside the chain of command. The Hells Angels operated with a defined hierarchy: president, vice president, sergeant-at-arms, treasurer, and structured regional oversight. Authority flowed through recognized channels. Replacement protocols were not improvised during crisis. This created continuity under enforcement pressure. When key members were arrested, the organization did not collapse into confusion. Responsibilities transferred within an established system. Discipline was enforced internally, reducing unpredictable internal disputes during periods of external attack. The Rock Machine MC developed rapidly in response to Hells Angels' dominance. Its leadership relied heavily on strong personalities and regional loyalty networks. That approach fueled early expansion and visible defiance. It allowed swift mobilization, but dependence on influential individuals creates vulnerability. When those individuals were targeted by law enforcement or killed during escalations, operational clarity weakened. Decision-making became uneven across chapters. In sustained conflict, inconsistency becomes costly. Law enforcement understood this dynamic. Large-scale investigations aimed not only at arresting members, but at disrupting communication patterns and isolating leadership figures. Surveillance and informant recruitment were designed to create mistrust. Under such pressure, centralized leadership models tend to perform differently than personality-driven networks. The Hells Angels' institutionalized governance allowed them to absorb removal of individuals without dismantling the broader structure. The Rock Machine experienced more pronounced instability when influential leaders disappeared. Internal disputes further strained cohesion. Differences in strategy emerged, whether to escalate visibly or reduce exposure to survive enforcement intensity. Diverging preferences within chapters signaled stress fractures. In a symmetrical war, both sides must maintain unified command. When unity wavers, parity begins to erode. Violence as a controlled mechanism.
As the Hells Angels were, they could perform tricks, do all kinds of crazy stunts that I couldn't do. And riding in a pack of Hells Angels, it takes an enormous amount of focus.
Hells Angels' violent biker war with the Rock Machine MC is remembered for explosions, assassinations, and public fear. Those events dominate historical memory, but violence in this conflict functioned less as uncontrolled rage and more as calculated messaging. Every detonation, every targeted killing, altered perception. It signaled capacity. It tested resolve. It forced smaller organizations and independent operators to reassess allegiance. At its height, the Quebec conflict produced a pattern of reciprocal attacks that reinforced the appearance of symmetry. One side struck, the other responded. Civilian spaces were not immune from collateral damage, and public anxiety intensified political and law enforcement scrutiny. On the surface, this looked like a war, locked in equilibrium, but equilibrium in violence does not automatically equal equilibrium in resilience. For the Hells Angels, authorization for high-risk actions typically followed internal discipline. Violence needed to serve territorial consolidation or reinforce deterrence. Escalation without structural gain risked unnecessary exposure. This imposed restraint within aggression, tactical use of force aimed at long-term positioning rather than immediate emotional retaliation. The Rock Machine responded with visible resistance. Retaliatory violence preserved internal morale and reinforced the narrative of parity. Members could see that leadership was willing to strike back, yet repeated escalation increased investigative intensity, law enforcement resources expanded, surveillance deepened. Each violent exchange amplified scrutiny, and scrutiny disproportionately impacts the organization with less diversified infrastructure. Sustained violence creates operational fatigue. Legal defense costs rise. Informant risk increases. Community backlash strengthens investigative authority. The side, capable of absorbing that compound pressure while maintaining administrative control, gains structural advantage. Violence becomes less about who strikes hardest and more about who can endure its consequences. By the time the conflict reached later years, overt violence declined. This did not mean hostility had disappeared. It meant that escalation no longer produced strategic benefit for the dominant structure. When one organization consolidates territory and stabilizes revenue streams, spectacular violence becomes inefficient. Control can be maintained without explosions. Law enforcement as a catalytic force.
An informant willing to betray the Hells Angels. But the informant is a lifelong criminal and a rising star within the
Hells Angels' violent biker war with the rock machine MC did not unfold in isolation. Law enforcement pressure escalated alongside the violence, and that pressure reshaped the conflict's trajectory. Investigations expanded, from local policing to coordinated task forces. Wiretaps, surveillance operations, and large-scale raids targeted not only individual members, but the infrastructure that sustained both organizations. The war narrative often focuses on bombs and assassinations. The institutional response was equally decisive. Major operations removed senior figures, seized assets, and disrupted communication networks. The objective extended beyond arresting perpetrators of specific violent acts. It aimed to weaken the administrative backbone that allowed retaliation to continue. When leadership figures are detained, decisions slow. When cash reserves are frozen, territory becomes harder to defend. Enforcement pressure transforms violent competition into structural endurance. The Hells Angels had already embedded international depth into their model. Financial redistribution across chapters provided resilience. If one region became heavily scrutinized, operations could be adjusted. Replacement leadership followed established hierarchy. This capacity to adapt under investigative heat preserved continuity even as arrests accumulated. The Rock Machine MC experienced enforcement differently. Concentration in Quebec meant that investigative pressure struck at core operational zones. When key members were removed, replacement mechanisms were less standardized. Legal expenses drained concentrated revenue streams. Informant recruitment increased mistrust within chapters. These pressures did not eliminate the organization, but they narrowed its flexibility. Law enforcement also altered public perception. The more violence escalated, the greater political demand for expanded powers. Specialized anti-gang units gained resources. Intelligence sharing intensified across provincial and national borders. The environment became increasingly hostile to sustained open confrontation. A war between equals requires both sides to maintain retaliatory capacity despite external intervention. As enforcement pressure mounted, the question shifted from who could strike harder to who could survive longer under scrutiny. Survival under pressure is structural, not theatrical. By the mid-2010s, overt violence had diminished, but enforcement attention remained. One organization retained administrative continuity despite sustained raids. The other faced compounded strain from concentrated disruption. Law enforcement did not declare a winner. It amplified structural differences that gradually reshaped the balance of power. The war label remained, but the battlefield was increasingly defined by resilience under institutional pressure rather than explosive retaliation alone. Alliances that failed to equalize power.
Hey, bro! Yeah, I'm a fucking hunk this fucking beat. I don't give a fuck, man, where the haters at?
Hells Angels' violent biker war with the Rock Machine MC was not confined to two logos. As pressure intensified, alliances became strategic tools. The Rock Machine sought external reinforcement to counter the structural depth of the Hells Angels. Alignments with larger international clubs were intended to project parity and deter further encroachment. On paper, numbers increased, Symbolically, the conflict appeared recalibrated. Structurally, the outcome was more complicated. Affiliation offers two potential advantages: expanded manpower and perceived deterrence. When a club signals that it is backed by a larger network, rivals must reconsider the cost of escalation. However, alliances require operational integration. Shared identity does not automatically create unified command. Differences in governance, financial expectation, and strategic priority can limit cohesion. The Hells Angels had already built an international network with standardized entry protocols, prospect phases, filtered recruits. Financial obligations were regulated. Internal discipline ensured compliance across chapters. When expansion occurred, integration followed clear rules. This minimized friction between regions and preserved unified strategy during conflict. The Rock Machine's pursuit of alliance functioned partly as a defensive adaptation. It sought to strengthen legitimacy and signal that it would not be isolated, but affiliation under pressure can strain autonomy. Chapters accustomed to localized leadership must adjust to external oversight. That transition introduces tension. In periods of sustained enforcement and violence, such tension can reduce strategic clarity. Alliances also complicate investigative exposure. Law enforcement attention expands when networks widen. Shared events, joint appearances, and coordinated operations increase visibility. While alliances may increase numbers, they can simultaneously increase scrutiny. For an organization already managing concentrated enforcement pressure, expanded visibility is not always advantageous. Parity in war requires equal structural coherence. External reinforcement can bolster morale and project strength, but without equivalent governance architecture, it may not produce lasting equilibrium. As the years progressed, alliance symbolism did not translate into territorial reversal at scale. Consolidation continued incrementally. Internal fracture and the cost of prolonged conflict. Hells Angels' violent biker war with the Rock Machine MC appeared externally as a unified confrontation. Internally, sustained pressure created fracture points that gradually altered the balance. Prolonged violence, repeated arrests, and financial strain test cohesion. In organized crime structures, loyalty must withstand not only external attack, but internal doubt. When unity weakens, parity weakens. The Rock Machine MC expanded quickly during its rise. Rapid recruitment brought visibility and strength. It also introduced variability in discipline and experience. New members entered an environment already under escalating enforcement scrutiny. Integrating them into a consistent operational code required strong centralized oversight. As arrests removed experienced figures, that oversight became harder to maintain uniformly. Sustained conflict forces strategic choices. Some chapters favored aggressive retaliation to preserve reputation. Others prioritized reducing exposure to survive enforcement intensity. Divergence in approach signals stress. When chapters begin interpreting risk differently, coordination slows. A war between equals demands synchronized decision-making. Fragmentation undermines that synchronization. Financial strain compounded this tension. Legal defenses required significant resources. Asset seizures reduced liquidity. When revenue becomes unstable, disputes over allocation increase. Questions emerge about leadership effectiveness. Informant suspicion deepens mistrust. Surveillance pressure amplifies anxiety inside tight networks. These dynamics do not produce immediate collapse. They erode cohesion gradually. The Hells Angels were not immune to internal strain. Arrests and prosecutions targeted their leadership as well. The difference lay in institutional discipline. Hierarchical clarity provided mechanisms for managing dissent. Replacement structures were predefined. Financial redistribution across broader territories cushioned localized disruption. Cohesion did not eliminate conflict, but it regulated it. As years progressed, the visible violence between both groups declined. Internal fracture within one organization and managed stability within the other influenced that decline. When a rival's internal strain increases, the necessity for overt confrontation decreases. Territory becomes easier to maintain without constant escalation. The word war implies unified fronts on both sides. Sustained conflict revealed that unity was not equally preserved. Internal fracture under pressure narrowed competitive capacity. The erosion did not happen overnight. It accumulated quietly. In prolonged confrontation, cohesion is currency. The organization able to preserve it retains leverage long after the loudest violence subsides. Financial infrastructure and sustained dominance.
One man is responsible for turning the Hells Angels into the most powerful crime machine the country has ever seen.
Hells Angels' violent biker war with the Rock Machine MC is remembered for its brutality, but brutality alone does not sustain a prolonged conflict. Financial infrastructure determines endurance. Without consistent revenue, legal defense weakens, recruitment slows, and territorial enforcement becomes unsustainable. Beneath the violence, the stability of income streams gradually influenced which structure could persist. The Hells Angels operated across multiple regions, creating diversified revenue channels. Drug distribution networks were not confined to a single urban core. Affiliated businesses and subordinate crews contributed financially through structured obligations. This produced a buffer effect. When one region faced intensified raids or asset seizures, other chapters could absorb part of the shock. Financial redistribution protected continuity. The Rock Machine MC was heavily concentrated in Quebec during the height of the conflict. Concentration can strengthen local dominance, but increases vulnerability when enforcement targets that specific geography. Raids on distribution hubs disrupted cash flow disproportionately. Legal expenses mounted. Asset forfeitures removed not only current funds, but future operational capacity. In sustained confrontation, liquidity becomes survival. Revenue is not merely profit, it is control. It pays for intelligence, legal counsel, transportation, and member support. When income becomes uncertain, morale shifts. Members evaluate risk differently when financial stability declines. Recruitment becomes more difficult when perceived resilience weakens. Financial strain also affects alliances. External partners expect contribution and reliability. If one organization struggles to maintain stable funding under pressure, alliance leverage decreases. Over time, financial imbalance translates into territorial imbalance. The organization capable of preserving diversified income can maintain presence even when violence subsides. By the mid-2010s, visible hostilities had diminished. Financial consolidation, however, continued. Territories once contested reflected more stable oversight by the organization with broader revenue architecture. Overt violence was no longer necessary to assert control when financial dominance had already secured position. A war between equals requires equal endurance. Endurance depends on money as much as manpower. The structural question behind the title becomes clearer when revenue stability is examined. The visible brutality defined public memory. Financial infrastructure defined who could sustain control once the spectacle faded. In prolonged conflict, endurance quietly outlasts aggression. Recruitment, absorption, and the quiet erasure.
It was very, very quiet until the famous events in Lennoxville. And I think that's what started everything.
Hells Angels' violent biker war with the Rock Machine MC did not depend solely on eliminating rivals. It also depended on recruitment patterns that reshaped the competitive landscape. In prolonged confrontation, new members determine whether an organization expands, stabilizes, or contracts. Recruitment is not just growth, it is leverage. The Hells Angels maintained a structured path for integration. Prospective members entered probationary phases before full inclusion. This process filtered instability and reinforced discipline. Smaller independent clubs faced a strategic calculation, resist and risk isolation, or align and gain protection within a broader network. Alignment gradually reduced the number of neutral entities available to challenge territorial authority. The Rock Machine MC also recruited aggressively during its rise. Rapid intake increased visibility and signaled defiance. However, accelerated recruitment under pressure constrained cohesion. New members require integration into operational norms. When enforcement intensity is high, that integration becomes harder. Arrest waves disrupt mentorship structures. Inconsistent discipline weakens unified response. Absorption alters balance quietly. When independent groups accept patchover or affiliation with the dominant structure, competitive parity shrinks without explosive confrontation. Each absorbed club removes potential reinforcement for the rival. Territorial maps change not only through violence, but through negotiated alignment. Recruitment also interacts with generational perception. Younger prospects gravitate towards structures perceived as stable and enduring. If one organization appears to weather enforcement raids while maintaining territorial continuity, it becomes more attractive to those seeking long-term viability. The rival, under visible strain, may struggle to maintain momentum. Over time, absorption produces an asymmetry that does not require dramatic battle. Opposition diminishes not solely through defeat, but through conversion. By the mid-2010s, contested territories increasingly reflected singular influence rather than visible dual presence. The term war emphasizes confrontation. Recruitment emphasizes consolidation. The shift from open rivalry to gradual absorption reframes the conflict's trajectory. When opposition narrows because potential challengers align elsewhere, sustained parity dissolves. The battlefield becomes administrative rather than explosive. The structural question behind the title deepens. Was this a prolonged war of equals, or a conflict gradually resolved through strategic absorption that reduced the need for further war? Reputation, media framing, and perceived parity. Hell's Angels' violent biker war with the Rock Machine MC was shaped not only by territory and violence, but by reputation. Reputation functions as psychological leverage. It influences how smaller groups choose allegiance, how communities respond, and how rivals interpret strength. During the height of the conflict, reputation created the illusion that two equally powerful forces were locked in permanent confrontation. Public perception was driven by visible events. Bombings destroyed property. High-profile assassinations removed key figures. News coverage repeated the cycle of retaliation. Each act reinforced the belief that neither organization could overpower the other. The appearance of constant counterstrike suggested equilibrium. Yet, reputation can outlive structural reality. Early years of escalation established a narrative of balanced rivalry. That narrative persisted even as internal conditions shifted. Organizational resilience, financial endurance, and leadership continuity do not generate dramatic headlines. Violence does. Media framing therefore preserved the impression of parity longer than operational evidence supported it. Fear also played a role. Smaller clubs and independent actors calculated risk based on perceived dominance. If both sides appeared equally capable of violent enforcement, neutrality became dangerous. Alignment decisions were shaped by which organization seemed more stable over time, not which delivered the loudest retaliation in a single incident. As enforcement pressure intensified and territorial overlap narrowed, the illusion of equal war began to fade operationally, though it remained potent in memory. The Hells Angels maintained visible continuity across regions. The Rock Machine adapted, restructured, and reduced contested exposure. The visible cycle of attack and counterattack slowed. Reputation can obscure imbalance. A war image can persist even when the structural contest has shifted. By the mid-2010s, the narrative of violent biker war remained strong in documentaries and retrospectives. On the ground, territorial consolidation suggested that the appearance of symmetry had thinned. The title emphasizes violent war. Reputation explains why that image endured. Structural endurance explains why the underlying balance changed. When one organization preserves continuity, while the other recalibrates under strain, parity becomes more psychological than operational. The war may remain in memory long after equilibrium has eroded. The attrition phase and the disappearance of open conflict. Hells Angels' violent biker war with the Rock Machine MC did not end with a decisive public confrontation. Instead, escalation gradually gave way to attrition. Attrition is quieter. It lacks the spectacle of bombings and assassinations. It functions through cumulative pressure, arrests, asset seizures, leadership removal, and financial strain. Over time, attrition determines which structure can continue operating without visible collapse. At the height of the conflict, reciprocal violence sustained the perception of equality. As enforcement intensified, both organizations faced repeated raids and prosecutions. Court cases extended for years. Intelligence units expanded surveillance capacity. The operational cost of open confrontation rose sharply. Each retaliatory act triggered deeper investigative penetration. Attrition tests endurance differently than direct conflict. It does not demand immediate retaliation. It demands the ability to sustain operations under continuous stress. The Hells Angels' layered governance model allowed responsibilities to shift when members were imprisoned. Financial redistribution across territories mitigated concentrated losses. Institutional memory preserved continuity despite arrests. The rock machine experienced attrition more acutely in concentrated regions. Leadership disruptions created operational hesitation. Legal expenses reduced liquidity. Recruitment slowed under increased scrutiny. Chapters adjusted priorities from expansion to preservation. Each adaptation narrowed capacity for sustained territorial challenge. As attrition accumulated, the necessity for overt escalation declined. Violence became less frequent, not because hostility disappeared, but because structural balance shifted. One side no longer needed explosive demonstrations to assert presence. The other faced mounting constraints that made large-scale retaliation riskier and less sustainable. Attrition often goes unnoticed in documentary storytelling because it lacks dramatic visuals. Yet it reshapes the battlefield more decisively than singular violent events. When parity erodes through cumulative strain, the visible war recedes without formal closure. The title invokes violent biker war, as if escalation defined its entirety. The attrition phase reveals that endurance under pressure ultimately shaped the outcome. Escalation created the spectacle. Attrition determined which structure remained capable of sustained governance once the spectacle faded. Rebranding, survival attempts, and strategic realignment. Hells Angels' violent biker war with the rock machine MC was not frozen in its original form. As years of conflict and enforcement pressure accumulated, transformation became necessary for survival. Rebranding and realignment are not signs of renewed strength. They are signals that original equilibrium has shifted. When an organization must alter its identity to remain viable, the structural context has changed. The rock machine MC underwent phases of reconfiguration during and after peak conflict years. Alignments with larger international clubs and shifts in identity were strategic decisions. The goal was to strengthen protection, increase legitimacy, and restore deterrence against encroachment. On the surface, new patches and affiliations suggested revitalization. Structurally, they reflected adaptation under constraint. Identity change introduces complexity. Members accustomed to local command must adjust to broader oversight. Financial expectations may shift. Strategic priorities may differ from original objectives. In times of stability, such transitions can enhance depth. Under sustained enforcement and territorial strain, they create internal adjustment pressure. The Hells Angels did not require comparable transformation. Their identity remained consistent. Organizational continuity reinforced perception of stability. Stability influences recruitment and alliance calculations. When one side maintains structural coherence while the other restructures, the different signals which organization absorbed greater strain. Rebranding does not eliminate rivalry, but it alters its shape. By the mid-2010s, visible confrontation had diminished and structural overlap narrowed. The narrative of violent war persisted in retrospective framing, yet the competitive environment had evolved. The need for transformation indicated that the original balance no longer held. A true war between equals sustains comparable institutional continuity on both sides. When one structure remains intact while the other recalibrates identity to survive, parity becomes difficult to maintain. The rebranding phase reveals more than cosmetic change. It exposes how prolonged conflict and enforcement pressure reshaped internal dynamics. The title emphasizes violent biker war. The evolution of identity suggests that by the time documentaries revisited the conflict, its decisive structural phase had already unfolded. Transformation became part of survival. Continuity became part of dominance. The consolidation of control beneath reduced visibility. Hells Angels' violent biker war with the rock machine MC is defined in public memory by explosions and assassinations. Yet, by the time the conflict reached its later years, What stood out most was not escalation, but its absence. Silence replaced spectacle. The decline in overt violence did not signal reconciliation. It signaled structural change. Active war requires continuous visible friction. Territory must be contested openly. Retaliation must remain credible and frequent. When contested zones stop shifting and dual presence fades, the conditions necessary for sustained war weaken. By the mid-2010s, regions once marked by visible rivalry reflected more stable governance patterns. The reduction in high-profile violence corresponded with accumulated attrition, enforcement pressure, and internal recalibration. When one organization retains administrative continuity and territorial control without frequent confrontation, escalation becomes inefficient. Maintaining dominance no longer requires explosive demonstration. Silence becomes a strategic posture. For the rock machine, strategic adjustments narrowed direct confrontation. Rebranding and alliance shifts altered operational focus. Reduced territorial overlap meant fewer flashpoints. Conflict did not vanish, but its scale and symmetry changed. Sustained visible retaliation became less viable under concentrated scrutiny and structural strain. Silence often carries more information than noise. It reveals whether parity remains intact. If two equally matched structures continue to exist in direct opposition, friction persists. If one side consolidates control and the other contracts or recalibrates, overt conflict subsides without formal resolution. Documentaries revisit the violent peak because it provides narrative clarity. The later phase lacks dramatic visuals. Yet the decline in visible warfare marks the decisive shift. Silence indicated that the conditions supporting balanced confrontation had eroded. The title suggests violent biker war in a sustained sense. Silence suggests that by the time the documentary revisited events, the structural contest had already tilted. War had defined the earlier years, consolidation defined the later ones. The absence of spectacle became evidence that escalation was no longer necessary for one side and no longer sustainable for the other. Institutional memory and the persistence of imbalance. Hell's Angels' violent biker war with the rock machine MC did not conclude with a public declaration of victory. There was no formal acknowledgement that one structure had prevailed. Instead, control settled quietly. When an organization consolidates territory and stabilizes revenue streams, celebration is unnecessary. Stability itself becomes confirmation. In prolonged conflict, visible triumph is rare. Arrests, casualties, and asset seizures mark years of strain on both sides. What determines outcome is not a final confrontation, but sustained operational continuity. By the later years of the conflict, territories once contested no longer reflected balanced enforcement. Dual presence diminished. Administrative oversight became consistent rather than fluctuating. Control without celebration reflects confidence. Public displays of dominance risk renewed scrutiny. Maintaining reduced visibility protects infrastructure. The Hells Angels' ability to operate without dramatic escalation signaled that visible deterrence was no longer required to maintain territorial integrity. Governance replaced spectacle. The rock machine's continued existence did not equate to restored equilibrium. Survival under altered conditions differs from competitive parity. Reorganization and narrowed territorial overlap indicated adaptation rather than symmetrical control. The competitive environment had shifted from open rivalry to differentiated stability. In organized conflict, dominance often reveals itself through routine. If businesses operate under consistent oversight without fear of rival intrusion, consolidation has occurred. If smaller clubs align predictably with one structure rather than oscillating between two, equilibrium has narrowed. The documentary lens highlights violence because violence defines memory. Control without celebration lacks dramatic footage. Yet the absence of renewed large-scale escalation demonstrates that structural balance had changed. One side no longer needed to prove capacity, the other no longer challenged at equivalent scale. The title emphasizes violent biker war as an enduring state. The quiet consolidation that followed reveals something else. War did not end with spectacle. It ended when visible proof of dominance became unnecessary. Control stabilized without ceremony, and the need for open war receded accordingly. the point where parity collapsed. Hell's Angels' violent biker war with the Rock Machine MC suggests sustained confrontation between two enduring rivals. To determine whether that description remained accurate, one question must be confronted directly. When did parity begin to fail? At the height of escalation, both organizations demonstrated retaliatory capacity. Violence moved in cycles, territory shifted, public perception reinforced symmetry. Yet, parity is not measured by isolated retaliation. It is measured by long-term structural balance, equal ability to maintain territory, replace leadership, finance operations, and absorb enforcement disruption without contraction. The collapse of parity did not occur during the most explosive year. It occurred gradually as attrition compounded unevenly. Law enforcement operations removed leadership figures. Asset seizures narrowed financial flexibility. Recruitment patterns shifted toward the organization, perceived as more stable. Smaller clubs recalculated alliances. None of these changes produced immediate headlines. Together, they altered the equilibrium. As territorial overlap narrowed, confrontation required less visible escalation. When one organization can operate in previously contested zones without sustained resistance, the definition of war changes. War requires continuous contestation. If one side no longer possesses equivalent capacity to contest territory at scale, the conflict transitions from war to dominance. The Rock Machine continued to exist. Its identity evolved. It adapted strategically, but adaptation under contraction differs from sustained competitive equality. Reorganization signaled structural strain. Consolidation by the rival signaled structural endurance. The reduction in large-scale retaliatory cycles reflected that imbalance. Parity collapsed not through surrender, but through cumulative disadvantage. One structure preserved administrative continuity across regions. The other recalibrated under pressure, narrowing scope. The visible violence that once sustained the appearance of equal war gradually became less frequent because the conditions for sustained symmetry no longer existed. The title frames the conflict as violent biker war. Violence was real, rivalry was real, but once parity dissolved, continued use of the term war requires scrutiny. By the mid-2010s, the operational landscape reflected consolidation more than sustained balance. The decisive shift did not arrive with spectacle. It emerged through incremental structural divergence that made equal confrontation increasingly unsustainable. When the war became a memory, Hell's Angels' violent biker war with the Rock Machine MC carries the weight of an active, ongoing confrontation. Yet there is a point in prolonged conflict where reality separates from memory. Violence can continue in isolated incidents while structural war has already ended. The distinction lies in sustained symmetry. Once symmetry fades, what remains is legacy, not live equilibrium. By the time the conflict was revisited in documentary form, the most explosive years were already historical. The bombings that defined public fear belonged largely to an earlier phase. Assassinations that once shifted territorial leverage had diminished in frequency. The rhythm of retaliation that once suggested constant tension slowed noticeably. This reduction was not accidental. It reflected a structural shift already underway. War requires two forces capable of continuous challenge. When one organization maintains territory with administrative consistency and the other narrows its operational scope, the balance changes. Continued existence does not equal continued parity. The Rock Machine persisted through adaptation and reorganization, but its ability to contest territory at the same intensity no longer matched earlier years. The Hell's Angels maintained broader continuity across regions. Memory preserves the most dramatic moments. Documentary framing reinforces those moments because they define narrative clarity. Explosions, arrests, and courtroom scenes remain powerful imagery. Structural consolidation does not produce comparable footage. It unfolds quietly through stabilized governance and reduced overlap. The shift from active confrontation to remembered confrontation is subtle. There is no public announcement, no ceremonial closure. It becomes visible only when analyzing territorial maps, recruitment flows, and enforcement focus. By the mid-2010s, those indicators showed reduced equilibrium. The title speaks of violent biker war as though the condition remained fixed. The The operational landscape suggests that by the time retrospectives highlighted the conflict, its decisive phase had already passed. What persisted was the imprint of rivalry, not the sustained structural balance that defines active war. The conflict transitioned from immediate confrontation to historical narrative, not through dramatic resolution, but through gradual consolidation that made further escalation unnecessary for one side and unsustainable for the other. The cost measured in bodies, not victory. Hell's Angels' violent biker war with the rock machine MC presents a direct claim, a violent war between two biker powers. The early years support that claim. There was organized retaliation. There were targeted killings. There were bombings that destabilized communities. Violence was not sporadic. It was sustained during its peak phase. In that period, the word war was defensible. The question is whether that condition remained true across the lifespan implied by the title. War requires ongoing symmetry. It requires both sides to retain comparable structural capacity to challenge control. When one organization consolidates territory while the other adapts under contraction, the definition shifts. The Hells Angels maintained institutional continuity. Leadership replacement followed hierarchy. Financial redistribution preserved operational stability across regions. Smaller clubs were absorbed through structured integration. Territorial presence remained broad. Even under enforcement pressure, continuity was not fundamentally disrupted. The rock machine demonstrated resilience during escalation. It resisted visibly and expanded aggressively. Yet enforcement pressure, leadership removal, financial concentration, and alliance recalibration gradually narrowed its operational scope. Rebranding and strategic realignment preserved survival but did not restore symmetrical territorial leverage. By the time the conflict was examined retrospectively, visible escalation had decreased. Territorial overlap was reduced. Retaliation cycles were less frequent. The competitive landscape no longer reflected sustained dual enforcement at the same scale. The title captures the violent phase accurately. It does not capture the structural resolution that followed. The war existed. It was intense, but it did not remain a balanced, indefinite confrontation. It evolved. The decisive factor was not a final clash. It was cumulative divergence in organizational endurance. When measured against the full record, the title describes the spectacle more than the outcome. Violence defined the memory. Structural consolidation defined the end state. The phrase, violent biker war, is historically accurate for its peak years. It becomes incomplete when extended beyond the point where parity had already begun to erode. Silence, as evidence of structural resolution. Hell's Angels' violent biker war with the rock machine MC began as open confrontation. It carried the characteristics of war: retaliatory violence, territorial instability, leadership targeting, and public fear. For a period, both organizations demonstrated the capacity to inflict and absorb damage. That phase justified the language of war. But conflicts do not remain static. They either sustain equilibrium or evolve into dominance. As years progressed, structural differences became more decisive than visible aggression. One organization preserved international depth, disciplined governance, and financial resilience. The other confronted cumulative pressure, concentrated within its strongest regions. Enforcement intensified, leadership gaps widened, recruitment recalibrated, territorial overlap narrowed. War requires continuous contestation. By the mid-2010s, contestation had diminished in scale and frequency. The visible cycles that once defined the rivalry slowed. Stabilized governance replaced fluctuating control in previously disputed zones. This did not mean hostility disappeared. It meant structural equilibrium no longer existed at the same intensity. The rock machine's continued presence reflected adaptation rather than symmetrical power. Survival through reorganization differs from sustained parity. The Hells Angels maintained administrative continuity without dramatic escalation. When escalation becomes unnecessary for one side and increasingly risky for the other, the conflict has changed form. The title frames the conflict as violent biker war. The full arc reveals that violence marked its most visible chapter, not its conclusion. The decisive shift occurred when one structure no longer required open confrontation to maintain control. War, in its sustained symmetrical sense, transitioned into consolidated dominance. What the conflict ultimately became was not a perpetual duel between equal rivals. It became a prolonged process of structural divergence. The early years justify the title, the later years redefine it. Violence explained the beginning, endurance explained the end. The documentary lens versus operational reality. Hell's Angels' violent biker war with the rock machine MC remains a phrase that captures attention because it reflects undeniable brutality. The explosions were real, the assassinations were documented. The fear was measurable, yet spectacle can obscure trajectory. When evaluating the full arc of the conflict, the decisive factor was not who struck hardest in a given year. It was which structure preserved coherence as pressure intensified. At its peak, the conflict met the criteria of war: reciprocal violence, unstable territory, and sustained hostility. That phase shaped public memory, but parity is fragile. It must be maintained continuously to justify the ongoing use of the term. Once one side can govern territory without constant retaliation from the other, symmetry dissolves. The Hells Angels retained layered governance across regions. Arrests disrupted individuals but did not dismantle hierarchy. Financial redistribution stabilized operations. Recruitment pathways remained intact. Administrative oversight continued even when visibility decreased. Stability replaced spectacle. The rock machine endured and adapted. Its persistence demonstrates resilience, yet adaptation occurred under narrowing leverage. Rebranding and strategic realignment signaled adjustment to structural strain. Territorial overlap diminished. Escalation cycles slowed. Competitive intensity reduced not through agreement but through imbalance. The structural truth is that the conflict evolved beyond the conditions that defined its most violent period. It did not conclude in a dramatic collapse. It settled through incremental consolidation. The organization that maintained governance without sustained open confrontation effectively secured dominance. The title preserves the violent chapter accurately. It does not fully reflect the later structural state. What began as war transitioned into differentiated endurance. Violence marked the most visible years. Structural continuity marked the decisive shift. The spectacle remains in documentaries and retrospectives. The deeper reality lies in how the conflict stabilized. The truth beneath the phrase is not that violence was exaggerated. It is that violence was only one phase of a longer process that gradually resolved the balance of power. What the title ultimately conceals, Hells Angels' violent biker war with the rock machine MC, describes a conflict that undeniably erupted in violence. For a period, it functioned as genuine war. Bombings, assassinations, and territorial instability reflected reciprocal capacity. Both organizations demonstrated willingness and ability to retaliate. In that phase, the title is accurate. The full trajectory, however, reveals that sustained parity did not endure indefinitely. War requires continuous symmetry in structural resilience. As enforcement intensified and attrition accumulated, divergence became measurable. One organization preserved layered governance, financial redistribution, recruitment discipline, and territorial continuity across regions. The other persisted, but adapted under concentrated pressure, narrowing its operational scope. Over time, overt confrontation decreased, not because hostility vanished, but because escalation was no longer structurally necessary for one side and increasingly costly for the other. Stabilized governance replaced fluctuating territorial control. Administrative dominance replaced visible retaliation. The battlefield shifted from explosive rivalry to quiet consolidation. The title captures the violent chapter faithfully. It does not capture the structural resolution that followed. The conflict began as war. It evolved into imbalance. By the mid-2010s, the defining feature was no longer sustained symmetrical confrontation, but differentiated endurance. The truth embedded in Hells Angels' violent biker war with the rock machine MC is not that the violence was overstated. It is that the violence represented a phase within a longer structural contest. The decisive outcome emerged gradually, without a final dramatic clash. What appeared as prolonged rivalry ultimately resolved through endurance, governance, and consolidation. War defined the beginning. Structural dominance defined the end. The moment the war stopped being a war, Hell's Angels' violent biker war with the Rock Machine MC is remembered as one of the most explosive criminal confrontations in modern Canadian history. The phrase alone suggests open rivalry, sustained retaliation, and two biker powers locked in violent equilibrium. For years, bombings shattered storefronts, assassinations removed key figures. Entire neighborhoods lived with the fear that another explosion could follow without warning. The spectacle was undeniable. It looked like a war in every visible sense. But wars are not defined only by violence, they are defined by balance. A true war between equals requires more than reciprocal aggression. It requires structural symmetry, equal leadership continuity, equal financial endurance, equal territorial leverage, and equal capacity to absorb institutional pressure. When one side can endure disruption without losing operational cohesion, while the other begins to narrow its scope, the nature of the conflict changes, even if the violence has not yet fully subsided. At the height of confrontation, parity appeared real. Each strike was answered, each territory contested. Media coverage reinforced the perception that neither organization could overpower the other. Law enforcement described a climate of organized retaliation. The public narrative solidified around the image of two rival biker empires locked in permanent combat. That image became the foundation of documentaries, investigative reports, and criminal folklore. Yet beneath the visible cycle of attack and counterattack, deeper structural factors were at work. Organizational design determined resilience. Hierarchical clarity determined whether leadership loss created collapse or continuity. Financial infrastructure determined whether legal costs and asset seizures could be absorbed or would cripple operations. Recruitment discipline determined whether expansion created stability or strain. As enforcement pressure intensified and arrests accumulated, the test of endurance began. Sustained conflict under scrutiny does not reward the loudest retaliation. It rewards the structure capable of maintaining governance under stress. Over time, visible escalation slowed. Territorial overlap narrowed. Confrontation became less frequent in areas once defined by instability. The spectacle that had defined the war's early years began to recede. The question at the center of Hell's Angels' violent biker war with the Rock Machine MC is not whether violence occurred. It did. The question is whether that violence sustained true parity across the lifespan implied by the title. This investigation moves beyond explosions and headlines to examine hierarchy, territory, finances, leadership, and attrition. The truth does not emerge from a single dramatic moment. It reveals itself gradually through structural endurance, quiet consolidation, and the slow transformation of what once appeared to be a balanced war into something far less symmetrical. The moment the war quietly ended, Hell's Angels' violent biker war with the Rock Machine MC did not end with a final explosion. There was no single assassination that marked closure, no public declaration of defeat, no dramatic confrontation that resolved the rivalry in one decisive night. Instead, the war ended quietly, so quietly that many did not recognize it had ended at all. In its peak years, the conflict carried unmistakable markers of active war. Territories shifted through force, bombings disrupted commercial districts, leadership figures were targeted deliberately. Retaliation followed retaliation in a rhythm that suggested neither side would yield. Public fear reinforced the belief that the rivalry was permanent. The violence appeared self-sustaining. But prolonged war requires continuous symmetry. It demands that both organizations retain the ability to escalate at comparable scale. Over time, that symmetry began to erode. Law enforcement operations intensified and became more sophisticated. Arrests removed experienced operators. Asset seizures restricted liquidity. Surveillance infiltrated communication channels. The environment changed. What shifted was not hostility, but sustainability. One structure retained layered governance and the ability to redistribute operational strain across regions. When leaders were imprisoned, replacements emerged within a defined hierarchy. When one corridor became unstable, operations adjusted elsewhere. Continuity persisted beneath scrutiny. The other structure continued to exist and resist, but its flexibility narrowed. Concentrated enforcement pressure in key territories compounded leadership gaps and financial strain. Reorganization and realignment preserved survival, yet the scale of direct territorial contestation diminished. Visible retaliation cycles slowed. The decline in explosive confrontation did not signal reconciliation. It signaled structural imbalance, reaching maturity. When one organization no longer needs frequent demonstrations of dominance and the other cannot sustain equivalent escalation without disproportionate risk, the character of conflict transforms. War becomes memory rather than active condition. This transformation does not generate headlines, it produces absence. Fewer bombings, fewer retaliatory strikes, fewer contested zones. Administrative stability replaces fluctuating enforcement. Control becomes routine rather than dramatic. The title, Hell's Angels: Violent Biker War with the Rock Machine MC, captures the years when violence defined the rivalry. What it does not immediately reveal is how that rivalry concluded. The war did not end in spectacle. It ended when sustained parity collapsed, when escalation no longer served strategic necessity for one side and became structurally unsustainable for the other. The quiet end is harder to recognize because it lacks cinematic closure, yet it is more decisive than any single violent event. The moment the war quietly ended was the moment structural dominance no longer required noise. What the violence was really protecting. Hell's Angels' violent biker war with the Rock Machine MC is remembered for its brutality, but brutality was not the objective. Violence was a method. The objective was control. Every bombing, every assassination, every retaliatory strike was designed to protect something far less visible than the explosion itself: revenue streams, influence networks, and administrative authority. During the peak years of confrontation, violence appeared constant. It created the impression of chaos and mutual aggression, yet random chaos does not sustain organized conflict for years. Behind each act of force was a calculation about territory, distribution channels, and deterrence. The violence was not simply reactive, it was protective. For the Hells Angels, territorial control meant regulated income and layered influence. Their governance model required stable zones where operations could continue without rival interference. If those zones were challenged, visible force restored deterrence. The objective was not spectacle, it was reinforcement of boundaries. The Rock Machine pursued similar goals during its expansion phase. Contesting territory was not symbolic defiance. It was an attempt to establish parallel control over profitable regions. Retaliation signaled that resistance would not be passive, but resistance also required infrastructure capable of absorbing counterpressure. As law enforcement intensified its response, the cost of protecting territory increased. Asset seizures and arrests disrupted the financial systems that violence sought to defend. When financial strain accumulates unevenly, the ability to continue protective violence weakens. The side capable of maintaining revenue continuity can reduce visible aggression without surrendering influence. By the mid-2010s, the scale of open confrontation had decreased. This was not because the underlying objectives disappeared. It was because one organization no longer needed frequent violence to protect its position. Administrative continuity and deterrence had stabilized control. The rival adapted under constraint, preserving existence but narrowing contestation. The title emphasizes violent biker war. The violence was real, and its impact was severe, but the deeper story lies in what that violence was defending. It was defending structural power. When one structure successfully secured that power through endurance, the necessity for overt conflict diminished. The spectacle defined public memory. Protection of infrastructure defined strategic intent. Once infrastructure stabilized under one side's governance, violence became less frequent because its purpose had largely been achieved. War, at that point, ceased to be a condition and became a chapter in a longer structural shift.